Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
For many people, the native taiga, which we sometimes hear about in the news and television programs about animals, is just a vast area overgrown with coniferous forests. This is a misconception. The taiga is not only a harsh world of wildlife, but also a little explored area with its unique properties and ancient secrets. It is possible to get to these secluded places in two ways: to fly to Norilsk, then to Dudinka, then by helicopter to Tukhart settlement, then by hunting trails, where along the river on a motorboat, and where on foot over several days of crossing. Or if you are not an ordinary guest, rent a cross-country vehicle and drive from Norilsk. Whichever way you choose, it's still several days to endure wandering through taiga. And in that area it is wild and destructive. A seemingly safe place may turn out to be a swamp, so it's silly to go without a guide. And it is dangerous to be alone, even with cross-country vehicles, to be 300 kilometers away from the nearest settlement. Though there is almost nothing to be afraid of in taiga. Animals, if you do not invade their lair, prefer to stay away, and people in those areas rarely appear. I was there myself only on occasion. At first we walked the route with the drilling crew, exploring, so to speak, the way to the deposit. And then I encouraged one of the local old-timers, Grandpa Isai from the Nganasan people, the original inhabitants of this wild land, to go on a hunting trip. The grandfather refused for a long time, muttering all sorts of nonsense about the beasts being very vicious, but for a couple of bottles of white he agreed to be my escort. Though it was difficult to judge who helped whom, the grandfather was old and frail in appearance, but he knew the woods of the district excellently. We gathered soon. Then we went out on a motorboat, going along the river heading to the south for a day. Then we headed through the channels for a long walk. At the end we left the boat on the hill to avoid it being washed away by the current, and we walked further west into the swamps. It was a wonderful hunt. The animals were not frightened, load the gun and shoot at it. So by the end of the second day, we had enough trophies and decided to go back. The old man, Issei, got worried and suggested that we no longer spend the night in the woods, but go to the motorboat without stopping and resting. It is not clear where the old devil got his strength from. I was at my limit. I could not help believing the stories told by men that Issei was the last Nganasan shaman and could do things that others could not do. I just did not dwell on it then. I decided to just agree. Although, man supposes and taiga disposes. I did not understand what happened, but we did not make it to the boat before dark. My grandfather was almost hysterical. He was shouting at me not in Russian, swearing at the vodka, for which he had agreed to bring me here, and he was almost crying. I felt ashamed and asked him to forgive me. But he just snorts and looks around. Suddenly he grabbed me by my waist belt and dragged me with such inhuman strength. It felt like an hour had passed. When the forest parted, we came to an abandoned lodge. Hunters built such huts, so they have a place to hide from bad weather and snowstorms. A small hut made of solid timber. There are arrow slits instead of windows. The door is small and low. It was dry and warm inside. Issei literally dragged me inside and began frantically locking the door. He piled everything inside the hut against it and plugged the arrow slits with rags. I looked at all this and silently stared. The shaman does not say a word, and obviously he is preparing for something. It was already dark when Issei sat down in front of me to catch his breath and lit a single light to light a cigarette. He smokes and looks me in the eye. And I was staring into his eyes, too, thinking. Issei's staring at me for some reason. Then he says with sympathy, "You'd better be scared sometimes, though you wouldn't get in such shit, Sanya." Not another word. Time goes by and nothing happens. The old man is sitting with his carbine in his arms. I'm starting to doze off after all the stress and fatigue has taken its toll. And through my sleep I hear a knock on the roof. As if a child had run. The footsteps are frisky and light, but heavier than a squirrel or a marten, for sure. And then there was a whistle from behind the door and another knock, but harder and with pressure on the door. Sleep was lifted like a lightning bolt. And Issei pressed his finger to his lips, shook himself, and showed me to sit quietly. And so half the night. Creak. Knocking. Whistling. It felt uncomfortable, as if they were trying to claw you out of your shell. Then it stopped abruptly. But we never fell asleep. In the afternoon we went straight out to the boat. It was about a kilometer from the place where we slept. I'm not interested to know what came to us at night, because I do not want to go there again. In the spring of 2006, a cave with unusual petroglyphs was discovered in the southern taiga. 3 months later, a private expedition of 5 people led by Nikolai K. was sent to explore the forest dungeons. The main goal of the expedition was to explore the caves and the strange rock paintings without attracting undue attention. The potential grandiosity of the find had not only historical but also a financial value. A day after the researchers arrived at the site, they radioed for help and a rescue helicopter was dispatched to their camp. When the rescuers returned, they had to rush the only survivor to the local intensive care unit. His eyes and ears were streaming purple blood, and his condition was considered critical. The patient was in a semi-conscious state and was constantly whispering something. Under the influence of strong antibiotics and tranquilizers, Alexei felt better by morning and was able to talk about what had happened. Here is an excerpt from his testimony.
I told him that the huntsman's find didn't bode well, but he wouldn't hear of it. That's how it turned out. In the evening, closer to the night, I went to get firewood, and the others were near the tents. And then there was a bang. A scream, a roar, or a murmur. I can't tell what it was, but it was like a scream or something. Or a lot of screams. Inhuman. Very loud. My ears seized up, my eyes went dark, and I fell down. I do not remember how I got there, but there. In short, everybody was dead. I came up and looked, and they were bleeding from their ears. I took Karelian's radio. I don't remember the rest. I must have passed out.
The next day, Alexei died. According to unconfirmed information, his heart failed to withstand strong medical preparations. According to other sources, the patient died of brain inflammation. All of the deceased researchers had damaged eardrums and some internal organs. There was an impression that the researchers were in the epicenter of some explosion, but there were no external injuries on their bodies. It is unclear what could have caused such a noise in the middle of nowhere in the Taiga. The entire region was searched up and down, and eventually a small cave caught the eye of the task force. Rock paintings of strange content and a deep natural tunnel into the bowels of the earth were found there. Fearing wild animals and collapses, the law enforcement officers abandoned the cave. A year later, another expedition came to the same place, but they failed to find the cave. There was a huge boulder in its place, behind which there was nothing. It was as if the ill-fated dungeon was a wound for the Taiga, which had grown over it without a trace.
It was a long time ago, somewhere in the 1980s. They went berry picking and mushroom picking in Agaz, 66. A common occurrence for all of us, nothing special. The place had already been chosen in advance, so there was no time to search. The forest they went to was far away from the people. We can say simply, we went to the Taiga. Those who went there know that anything can happen in the Taiga. Mushrooms and berries did not take long to find and showed themselves to be taken. Time flew by quickly and it was getting dark. It was getting cooler. The blue sky, which shone so much blue in the daytime, was slowly dissolving into the approaching gloom. A cool breeze was blowing on his face, which was not as cheerful as it had been at the beginning of the walk. Fatigue was taking its toll. They were going back to the car from the last trip for mushrooms. They had not so many mushrooms in the buckets as at the beginning of the day. These mushrooms became too familiar to them. The car appeared in the glade, to which they have already returned 50 times today, but this time was the last. Now the buckets in the car and go home. After pouring the last batch of mushrooms into a plastic bag, they calmly got into the car. Slowly turning the ignition key, the car shuddered, but did not start. The starter was spinning idly. The driver tried again, but the result was the same. Tried a couple more times, but nothing changed, only the echo of the iron horse, in which inside, something was spinning, spread through the Taiga. Strangely enough, they thought, the car was as good as ever, but for some reason did not start. Would they have to go through the car again? They decided to wait a minute and try to start the car again, but if it didn't start, they would have to dig around. Staring dumbly through the windshield from the tiredness of the car, they heard the loud crunching of branches nearby. The dusky light made it impossible to see what was already 30 meters away from the car, and there was no point in looking closely to see what was crunching there. They both shuddered. All they needed now was a bear. No need to make any noise now, let him go himself. The crunching of twigs became even louder, and a loud growl could be heard. Bears don't growl like that, and wolves don't crunch branches like that. Fear began to set in, and my heart began to pound, panting, and darkening more and more with each passing minute. What broke the silence of the forest could be heard, by its loud growl, as it approached the car. They sat, huddled in the seats of the car, and scrutinized what was ahead, trying to see who it was. A large silhouette appeared at the end of the clearing, and it was from there that the growling came. Those sitting in the car almost stopped breathing, lest they be seen or heard. The creature, seeing the unfamiliar, and as big as the car, stopped growling and began to stare intently. Fear began to restrain its movements. The creature's silhouette was visible at the end of the clearing, and it was large and unlike any animal of that size. The creature slowly began to approach, its heavy footsteps could be heard, even in the car. What it would be like to see it in all its glory. Goosebumps, hair spluttering, shivers, engulfed those in the car, but they did not break the silence and sat in silence. The creature disappeared from sight and no heavy footsteps or growls could be heard. Either it was gone, or it was alarming. The handle in the door slowly began to open the driver's door, which made the latter's eyes widen, and he grabbed the handle and grasped at the door. The door began to jerk. Apparently someone on the other side was opening the door, realized someone was in his way, and started to pull even harder. The other man in the car just dumbfounded and turned white. You could probably see the pallor on his face even at night. The door shook with such force that the GAZ 66 car, walking around, but the driver was so deadly, he clung to the door like he was glued to it. The next thing I knew, there was a bang on the door, so much so that the door trim and the door itself splintered like paper. The driver saw his hand. This was not the hand of some animal with such claws and so big that if you put that hand on a man's head, the hand would wrap around his head like a ball. The driver's strength increased with fear, even though blood was pouring out of the hand he had clawed and the handle crashed into the flesh of his palm. The car began to shake, and they could hear the thumping of the car as if it had been hit with a wall cannon. All of this brought both of them in the car to the last stage, and they screamed with fear like they had never screamed before in their lives. The car shook a couple more times, and everything went quiet. What was this, a respite or gone? But the two men who were sitting there yelled like cackling for another minute. They never got out of the car until morning. The creature didn't show itself again, or it was watching when they got out, or maybe it was scared of their screams, or it had gone away. They could probably hear them screaming for a couple of miles. The next morning, they tried to start the car. Surprisingly, it started up in half a minute, and then the car jerked away and drove away from the forest. The car was dented all over, and the door was torn, as if it had been slashed with claws.
I have repeatedly heard strange stories in the remote Taiga corners of Karelia. They were told by individuals and entire villages. Many eyewitnesses of these events are still alive today and tell them to their children and grandchildren. These are stories about witches and werewolves, who, it turns out, live with us and are our contemporaries. I bring two such stories to your attention. In general, probably in Russia there are not many places now, even if distant as the Karelian hinterland, where the national belief in various forms of magic and numerous beliefs is so strong. It carefully preserves the multifaceted experience of the older generations, associated with an original and deep view of the world, in many ways different from the modern cultured worldview. Christianity has brought humanity to a new qualitative level of God and self-knowledge, but it is no secret that the human soul is forever imprinted in the pagan world, a world for many much more real and vital, which has an undying magical and practical tradition of knowledge and interaction with the forces of nature. Paganism is a direct, open conversation that allows, on a domestic, practical level, to live a unified and living life with nature. Therefore, it is not surprising that in the Karelian hinterland, along with the Bible, one can find literature on witchcraft. It is not surprising that these so-called incompatible religions coexist in the souls of many people. It is possible that this amazing combination of outwardly incompatible beliefs that creates a specifically unique aura of a remote Karelian village, behind which often lies a completely unexplored spiritual world, a world full of originality and mystery. In a small village, Suisar, which is 20 kilometers away from Petrozavodsk, in the 80s, there lived a very strong witch who was revered not only in the village but in the whole region. At that time, she was already in her old age, and she rarely went out of her house, receiving visitors in her small room. She knew how to do everything. Shrewd, steely-eyed eyes pierced through, seeing your innermost self.
Whoever comes to me with a lie gets beaten and shaken. You can't lie to me.
The old woman said more than once. That is why not many people came to her. She had a wonderful power over nature and animals. The story goes that when a bear suddenly ran into the village in the winter, she came close to the roaring beast, asked him to go back into the woods and never come back. The ashamed giant rumbled apologetically and hurriedly shuffled into the taiga, and she returned to the house, preliminarily, down to the ground, worshipping only what she knows the forces and the gods. Her help was unselfish.
My life is my song. Whoever wants to listen, let him listen. I don't charge anything for it.
She laughed. One day she was approached for help. A cow had gone missing. They searched all evening, but it was all in vain. They ran to her.
The breadwinner is alive.
She consoled. After listening to the request, left the house and went beyond the village. Reaching a crossroads, she stopped and stood in silence for a long time. Then, with a prayerful request and a low bow, she appealed to the forest of the north side to give the cow, not to leave her. The tops of the trees swayed from side to side in a total windlessness. The leaves rustled. The roadside dust swept up in a snake. She's not there, she said. She then turned to the forest of the eastern side, but the same answer came. And only the forest of the south side nodded its spruce mane. Your breadwinner is alive, she repeated again to the attendants who were baffled and unbelieving their own eyes. Wait, and she herself went home without looking back. A little while later, a bell was heard ringing, and everyone saw the cow running toward them from the forest on the south side. Her death was quiet, she passed on her skills and knowledge by inheritance. But it is she who is still remembered firmly as the human heart can love and remember. In the 1990s, when traveling in the Podolsky region, I noticed tales about a certain strange man, whom popular rumor dubbed Werewolf. This man, Fedor Ivanovich Dudov, was a hereditary sorcerer and healer who had a bad reputation because of his absolutely intolerant and quarrelsome character. It was said that he possessed a certain knowledge that allowed him to turn into any animal. It was rumored that from time to time, from his house, located on the edge of the village, one could hear inhuman cries that turned into wolf howls. During these days, or rather nights, the village was flooded by wolves, causing awe among the locals. Wolves were shot, and in the morning their corpses disappeared. Dudov took them to the woods and buried them. He was feared, avoided, spat in the trail, but was never harmed. The people believed in his witchcraft power, that he could spoil crops, possess the evil eye, and could create an incurable disease. One day an event occurred that finally cemented Dudov's nickname as a werewolf. Dudov suddenly disappeared from the village. Day went by day after day, but he did not return, but it was noticed that at this time a pack of wolves appeared in the vicinity of the village, giving no rest day or night. They decided to make a roundup, set traps, and went out in groups to shoot them. Results were lamentable, when suddenly at night the village woke up from heartbreaking howls of pain and suffering, picked up by wolf's polyphony. And in the morning they saw Dudov coming back with a pale, haggard face and a badly bandaged hand, bleeding. They rushed to the place, where from during the night echoed a terrible, ominous cry, and in one of the traps we saw a chewed-up wolf's paw and numerous tracks of wolves. Nobody even touched the trap. The horror drove people away from this place. And Dudov from that time appeared only in the gauntlet on the right hand, irrespective of season. His hand remained in that trap forever. As terrible was his life, so was his death. It came 2 years after the events described above. Dudov was about 60 years old at that time. Apparently he felt death approaching. It is not known what he experienced in those moments. They say that he cried terribly for 24 hours, and in the evening he appeared on the porch of his house, looked at the village, at the people, and cried. And then he rushed into the woods, deafening the silence with either a heartbreaking human scream or a heartbreaking wolf howl. Hunting in winter in the taiga is an unforgettable experience. I loved going to my grandfather's house and with his hunting friends since I was a kid. I even had my own gun there. The adults always took me with them on trips to the woods. And this time that I arrived, there was going to be a big hunt for a bear that was killing cattle. They took me with them, but told me to stay a short distance behind them. We had 2 Siberian huskies with us, and they led us on the trail. The group consisted of 5 grown men, 2 experienced elders, and me, a boy of 17. We had been skiing for half a day in the snow, and, at last, in front of us appeared a huge cave, where the bear's den was. It was already getting dark, and we camped at a distance of 200 meters. Everybody went to sleep at once, and we left Vasily and the husky on patrol. Early in the morning I woke up to the noise. Everybody was already up and discussing something furiously. When I came nearer I saw Vasily sitting with his back to the tree, his chest and belly torn and his face grimaced with inhuman terror. The dogs were cowering at people's feet. Grandfather picked up Vasily's gun and examined it. The cartridges were intact. How could it be? The experienced hunter was so frightened of something that not only did not shoot, he could not even wake the others. Most of us thought Vasily had been torn by a connecting rod, and we continued on with the raid. Surrounding the den, we took up positions behind the trees. Peter took a long slingshot and climbed to the top of the driftwood above the beast's den. Having stuck the slingshot into the passage, he began to hide there, waiting for the bear to wake up. But suddenly something jerked the slingshot down. Peter could not keep his balance and fell down after it with a scream. His eerie scream,
"There's no bear,"
was cut off in the middle. We all backed away, and Peter's severed head flew out of the hole and landed in front of me. I screamed in horror and turned and ran. Behind me I heard shouting and gunfire, some growling and the squealing of huskies. Without looking back, I ran forward, falling through the drifts until suddenly I collapsed into the void beneath the snow. The fall knocked me out. When I came to, I saw that I was lying in a wolf trap pit. I was very lucky the stakes were sticking out around me. No shots were heard, and I thought the hunters had pulled it off after all. As I started to call for help, I heard someone's footsteps. "I'm here, I'm down. Get me out of here." The footsteps came to the edge of the pit. I couldn't see who was standing there, but I was suddenly scared. There was a heavy sniffing sound from above, which a human could not make. I crawled back to the wall, put my back against it, and raised my gun. "Who's there?" The answer was a withering roar from the creature, whose muzzle finally loomed over the pit. It looked like some creature from a nightmare, with its huge bloody jaws, its eyes burning with dull anger, its ears flattened. I yelled out loud and shot frantically at random. The bullet scratched across the creature's muzzle, and it started scurrying around the hole, trying to reach me with its long paw with curved claws. I pressed myself to the ground and shouted, the tears of despair gushing from my eyes. The creature had been rampaging around me all day, but the stakes saved my life as it never dared to jump down. I was very cold, and I knew that if I did not think of anything, I would die not from the fangs and claws of the creature, but from the cold, but I could not get up and start somehow to move. My death in the form of a huge paw of the creature was waiting for me from above. I tried to scream again, and suddenly, to my delight, I was answered. A rescue team was looking for us, stuck in the taiga. The creature raised its head and jumped away. I never saw it again. I was found by the rescuers. On my tip they found the others, or rather, what was left of them, bloody scraps of clothes and guns.
The cold autumn wind and endless disgusting light rain enveloped everything around them, and as they made their way through the dense woods, the two travelers, soaked to the skin, walked forward with difficulty. In the early morning haze behind them one could still make out the lights of a small village, but there was no way back. It had been a bad year, and in order not to die of hunger several men had gone hunting in the taiga. They divided into groups of 2 or 3 and headed in different directions. The village was in the very heart of the taiga. There was not a single living soul for many hundred kilometers around, and there was no one to help. It was getting late, the rain had not stopped for the whole day, and exhausted, with empty hands, Grandpa Matvey and his grandson Vadim sat down under a large branch of a spruce to rest and decide what to do next. "What's that over there?" The lad pointed at something dark, barely visible through the thick branches of the trees. "It looks like a house." "It's an old gamekeeper's lodge," the old man said, a little uneasy, "and there's a bad reputation for it. Many years ago in this house several people died mysteriously, all in blood, but their bodies were not found." The grandfather paused, looked around and went on. "After that, everyone who didn't stay here for the night never came back. Night in the taiga comes quickly. At a distance of a few meters nothing was visible. In the damp grass the fire did not want to start. "I don't believe in all these fairy tales," resolutely said Vadim. "Come on, let's go inside. Nothing will happen to us. I have no intention of staying under that fir tree all night to soak and freeze." He stood up, threw his backpack on his shoulder, and went to the lodge. His grandfather tried to stop him, but unsuccessfully, and he had no choice but to follow his grandson. The fire was instantly lit, warming the frozen people, and the lad gathered straw lying around and made 2 beds. The rain drummed monotonically on the roof, soothing the hunters. The fire was already barely smoldering, everything around was plunged into darkness. Suddenly Vadim woke up to a strange sound, a rustling and crunching sound through the noise of the rain. He whispered a call to the old man, but there was no answer. Slowly, and trying not to make any noise, Vadim crept to the place where the old man was sleeping, but he was not there. The guy went back to his place. It became uncomfortable. He kept hearing strange sounds from somewhere above, from the attic. After a few minutes, the eerie chuckling was replaced by a barely audible whisper. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't make out a word. Suddenly he heard a creaking sound coming toward him, as if someone or something was coming down the stairs from the attic and slowly heading toward Vadim. The rain suddenly stopped, and a large bright moon appeared in the sky, shining its light through a small window into part of the room. Nerves were on edge, Grandpa Matvey was gone, something incomprehensible was approaching him, a panicked fear gripped the boy. "Who's there?" Vadim shrieked, unable to endure. The creaking and whispering stopped, and a shadow flashed in the moonlight. The silence in the hut was very quiet, and he could hear the sound of his heart beating furiously. On his back he felt someone's intense gaze. Horror, fear, and a desire to flee gripped the young man. Turning around, he saw his grandfather, but he was horrible. The gray sunken face, rolling eyes, and a smacking mouth full of blood with horrible teeth, the creature stretched out its arms and headed toward Vadim. He ran out of the house and disappeared into the night. Taiga, branches whipped at his face, cutting his skin until it bled, but the boy paid no attention to it. He ran as far away from the place as possible. Suddenly Vadim ran out into the clearing. He froze in horror. That scary gray house stood in front of him again. The young man rushed into the forest again, but after a while he kept coming back to that horrible place over and over again. Enough! The boy fell to his knees, his strength left him, his brain refused to understand what was going on in that damned cabin. Vadim lost consciousness. A black cloud covered the moon and the taiga plunged into darkness again. It began to rain again, and in its monotonous noise suddenly heard the same clunking. Above the already lifeless body of Vadim his scary grandfather kneeled, tearing pieces of bloody meat from the corpse and greedily swallowing them. All the men returned from the hunt with good prey. The village was saved from starvation, missing only two, the old grandfather and his grandson. The villagers tried to look for them, but to no avail.
We live in remote places. Everything here is tied to oil. Almost everyone's professional activity is connected with it, our motherland. The distances in the north are enormous, but the landscape is monotonous. Marshes, marshes, and more marshes. One can get out of our settlement only in winter by winter road, and in summer by barge. Winter is long, 9 months, the sun barely warms up, clouds of gnats rise. You will not be glad of the summer. That's true, but it's rare for anyone to return to the mainland. Many come here to earn some money and stay forever. You find yourself in a trap, the north, the Taiga, the river. It seems that people here are completely different. There was an incident at the drilling site. The cook was on her break and went to a swamp to pick blueberries. You can see the rig far away and there's a lot of noise from it. You can't get lost. She didn't come back for supper. Everybody went to look for her, who was free. Drilling is a continuous process. No traces were found. We searched for 3 days, to no avail. We searched by helicopter and by ground crews. In a word, she disappeared in the Taiga. And on the 4th day she came out on her own. The gnat bit her badly. Her face and hands were covered with bumps and crusts. She was very hungry, frozen. The nights were cold. There is an unspoken rule: don't go to the Taiga without a match and a knife. It is not a recreation park. Anything can happen. She had no matches. She thought she would be back soon. She could light a fire. You could see the smoke from a far distance and get warm. We began to inquire of her how she went out of the Taiga. She did not want to answer. She was either frightened or simply tired. She did not leave soon. She could not do without a drink. Then she told me.
When I realized I was lost, it was already dark. I was not so afraid. I thought I would somehow endure the night and in the morning I would find my way. Gnats and mosquitoes overpowered me. At first I swatted them away, then I got tired. So they stuck all over my hands and face. I was thirsty. On the 3rd day, I didn't care about anything. I didn't feel cold or hungry. My eyes barely opened from the bites. When it got dark, I fell under a tree and fell into a deep sleep. I woke up from a touch, opened my eyes. There was a man standing there, all overgrown, with rags instead of clothes. I was frightened, but he beckoned me with his hand. He doesn't say a word himself. I got up somehow and followed him. I could not walk. I could not see anything. It was night. It was dark. You could poke your eyes out. I fell down many times and fell into oblivion. The man didn't leave me. At the end of the way, he almost carried me on his back. I was dumbfounded at the time. I was completely exhausted. I had no idea who he was, where he came from, where he was taking me. I wanted only one thing: to fall down and lie down. It began to get light, and then there was a noise. It meant that the drilling site was already closed. I cheered up, became more cheerful. I guess I had more strength. Well, I think it was the last spurt. I looked around and there was no man anywhere to be seen. I sat some more, waited, and went forward slowly. I passed a little bit, but behind me I heard rustling. I turned around. There was a wolf about 2 meters away from me. That's when I was really frightened. I can't run, I can't shout too. And he didn't seem to intend to attack, and he was shabby in some way. Then he ran away from me, turned around, stood there, and disappeared behind the trees. I walked from that place for another 20 minutes until I came across people.
Not everybody believed her, of course. One could never know what could happen in such a state. And then they began to notice that this cook was carrying waste from the kitchen to the Taiga. So she feeds the werewolf. She was then transferred to another site, to be on the safe side.
Autumn in Syrian, Komi, Taiga is always a festive time. It generously bestows a rich harvest of berries and mushrooms. But do not be lazy. You can fill the wagons and baskets with white mushrooms, milk-cap mushrooms, and crowberries, berries, cloudberries, blueberries, currants, and cowberries, as from the tablecloth of Samos bran. Good riddance. One day in late August, all three of us, my grandmother Mavra Petrovna, myself and our family pet, a Zerjanska Leka nicknamed Zarni, means golden in Russian, set out at dawn for Karasparma, 15 kilometers from our village, Shashki. Here grandmother Mavra has a hunting hut near the lake. It was built by my grandfather 40 or 50 years ago. But he passed away early in life. My grandmother had to learn the hunting business on her own. She knew how to fish from her teenage years. Hunting huts were built from each other at a distance of 10 to 15 kilometers, near streams or lakes. These huts were never locked. Maybe some hunter, fisherman or mushroom hunter caught by bad weather or infirmity will be forced to take shelter, get warm or even spend the night. Therefore near such a hut there is always a supply of fuel, dry deadwood, split stumps, firewood. In the hut suspended from the ceiling bag of bread crumbs, there are matches, salt, sugar, sometimes tobacco or a few pieces of cigarettes. Our hut had gotten pretty old, but it was in good order. As a result, we started to collect the gifts of the forest in no time at all. No matter how pleasant a nice autumn day in the taiga, by nightfall there is an inexplicable feeling of unease even in a cozy hut. That's why it is customary to lock oneself up from inside. The first day was successfully. Baskets and baskets were already filled with forest fruits. It was possible to go home. But we would only be about to return on the third day, when Misha's godson came back on horseback. He will stay a couple of kilometers from our place, because there are neither paths, nor glades, let alone roads up to us. But on the second day it suddenly got colder. We could not help it, it was in the north. We went down to the lake, grandmother cast a couple of handmade fishing rods, and the lake gave us more than a dozen of heavy fish, pike, bream, perch. We made a fire on the shore, cooked some fish soup, with smoke and wild onions. Autumn evening seemed especially dark because of a sudden chill, and the surroundings of the hut seemed uncomfortable. It was time to go to bed, but very strangely Zarni behaved, from the door now and then came to the window, then lay down on the trestle bed, then jumped and knocked at the door. Open, does not come out. For some reason she pushed us with her nose and growled. Her unusual behavior made us uneasy. Suddenly a human voice came to us from the taiga. It was the voice of a woman, repeating her grandmother's name many times, Mavra, Mavra, Mavra. Then a long wolf howl could be heard. I was not sleepy at all. The dog started rushing from the door to us, grabbing our clothes, growling threateningly. We tried to push her out of the hut, but she would not come out, continuing to drag us by our clothes. We had to get out, and then Zarni began to lick our hands, caressing us, continuing to drag us by our clothes to the pines, away from the cabin. And that's when we realized, something was threatening us. Suddenly there was a crack on the roof of the hut, as if someone heavy had fallen on it from a great height. In a minute the roof collapsed. The doors and the threshold were crushed, no way in, no way out. What a sense of intuition Zarni had. She practically saved us, driving us out of the dangerous hut. Many years have passed since that unpleasant incident, But it still remains unsolved. What was that voice in the night taiga? Why was also heard the howl of a lone wolf? Was it also a warning of danger?
Those who believe that the taiga is filled with animals waiting in ambushes for a careless man to enter the thicket in order to pounce on him and devour him mercilessly are very much mistaken. In fact, every animal hurries to get out of the way as soon as it hears man's footsteps. Even tigers and bears get out of the way of an unarmed mushroom hunter if they are not wounded and frightened. No one wants to mess with a human. Well, maybe except for gnats, ticks, and snakes. By the way, I was most afraid of a tick in the taiga. Bit by that bug, and the rest of your life, you'll smile cheerfully at his strange thoughts, or lie twisted into a spiral, if lucky to survive. And the pit viper is a rather large snake. It is characterized by viciousness and ineffable impudence. If, as I said above, all in a hurry to get out of the way, this one always defiantly strides towards you, hissing with a hiss, and tries to bite. A nasty creature, in short. But there is a disaster in the taiga when all the rules and laws are turned upside down. It's a fire. Everybody in the pack flees from it, both hunters and prey. Fire destroys the usual circle of events of the beast, and then it stands up against the man, considering him the only one responsible for all its troubles. At the end of December, we went with a ranger to chop Christmas trees for the holiday. The weather was fine, the frost was a little below -20, the sun was playing in the snowflakes, so everyone was in a great mood. The ranger decided to lead us to the glades, where there were many young Christmas trees. We were walking along the glade to the cutting area when a man in strange orange clothes appeared in front of us, waved to us as if inviting us to follow him, and disappeared into the trees. The distance to him was 300 to 350 meters, so to see the details of his clothes was impossible. But the man stood up like a stone. "You know, men, let's go closer, and the snow is getting deeper. I'm afraid it will be difficult to get there, and then to go back with the trees," I said, turning around back. Really, somehow it did not occur to me. If the snow was above our knees on the clearing, it would be even deeper in the woods. We, as usual, scratched our heads and followed the huntsman, who had gone quite far. After a while we had chopped some nice spruces and gathered in the lodge for some tea before we went back. And then a man looked right at the ranger and said, "Was that the fireman?" The ranger shrugged his shoulders. Naturally, everyone pressed on him to find out what kind of firefighter he is and what he extinguishes in the woods in the winter. After the third mug of tea, the ranger finally told us,
"Remember how things were burning around here about 5 years ago? There was nothing we didn't do. They used planes, helicopters, and fire paratroopers with parachutes. That was one of the groups, 5 men. One was very young, about 23 or 25 years old, and was admiring the scale. They went to the square. The guy was far ahead when a bear came out. He was walking on his hind legs. No one had time to blink before it slapped the guy. He just turned to the others and waved. Maybe he saw the smoke, maybe he just hurried up. They saw the helmet fly off, and the guy collapsed like a log. The beast turned to the others. What were they to do? They had nothing besides their water bags, so they took off running. They came running to us, searching. They found the body the next day, only the head wasn't with them. It wasn't the helmet that flew off. Only he didn't realize it. Neither that he was killed by a bear, nor that he had no head. This is what the local shamanist said when we went to her after several meetings with him. We only noticed, where he appears, there is a beast in ferocity, and here, in winter, for the first time."
Some of us believed it, and some of us, as usual, laughed through our mustaches. But I personally know hunters who hunted on the taiga this winter, which devoured all dogs in the settlement Hapsall, situated near the area of this huntsman. And before that there were fires nearby. I heard the following story from a comrade. A friend of his served in the Conti-Mansi Autonomous Area. The taiga was thousands of kilometers around and there was not a single living soul. About 150 kilometers away from his unit there were missile launchers. So, the commander sends their 2 soldiers whether on Ural or on Zil 131, in short on the big military truck to take something away. And he warned me not to stop on the road at night in any case. Even if I wanted to go to the bathroom and not to give anyone a lift or a ride. Well, the guys went to the rockets, took the necessary cargo, and drove back. At night in the taiga, you know what visibility is like, so the lights were on full blast. When they were 10 kilometers or so away from the military unit, they saw a girl in a white dress and kerchief going along the road. They were stunned. Why in the taiga, at 2 a.m., someone walks, and even a girl? But they decided to pick her up despite the commander's instructions. They drove up to the girl and called out to her. She turned around and had a horrible bear face with glowing eyes with clawed paws. A bear dressed in human clothes, walking in a human manner. Completely stunned, they quickly drove by. They didn't remember how they got to our unit, and they were treated for a long time afterwards. In general, the place is anomalous. They say people disappear there. Once in the 80s, an expedition of the USSR Academy of Sciences disappeared. UFOs are constantly observed there, and snow hominoids have been spotted repeatedly observed as soldiers and officers in the Taiga. There have also been sightings of something huge like snakes or plesiosaurs in lakes and rivers. Apparently, the commander knew what was out there when he warned the soldiers, but did not tell the details to not scare them, and that military trucks should not stop as stated in their instructions.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.